So I've got a story to tell that came to me from my grandmother. And whether or not that's true is part of the story. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to talk to you about the city in which my mom grew up, which is Indianapolis. And I'm going to talk specifically about this place. This is Indianapolis's Union Station. It's their railroad station. Now, what a Union Station is, it's when a lot of different railroads come together in a city, and instead of trying to fight over who gets what land for their stations, they all agree to have a station in one place. The station was built in 1888, but that's not the important part. Now, the station is still around, and it's being used now as a shopping complex. I've been there myself. It's actually pretty cool. And in the back of the complex, there are these old train cars, and you see the statuary sitting around. The old train cars are incidentally old Pullman cars, which are what they used to be the cars that people would sleep in for long journeys. You can now rent out one of these cars for a hotel room for the night. And as I was saying, they have this statuary around. Now, this particular statue is of Mr. Marcus Jefferson. He was coming home from service in World War II. He served in Germany. And this is when he arrived at Union Station in 1945. This picture, this is the statue of Mr. Ernest Klingerman. He was a conductor at Union Station for many, many years in the early part of the century. This is what he looked like in 1923. And these two boys are Oliver Westerhausen and Augie Messersmith. They were trying to sneak on to one of the trains. And this happened in 1915. Now, why I'm telling you about these people will come back, and they'll be important later. But I need to tell you that something bad happened. It didn't happen in Indianapolis, but it happened on the way to Indianapolis. There was a train on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that was destined to Indianapolis from Dayton, Ohio. And people to this day don't know exactly what happened, but the train experienced a huge wreck. In 1904, the train was wrecked, and all 178 people aboard were killed. This happened somewhere in the middle of nowhere in southeastern Indiana. Now, I want to tell you about a particular person who was on that train. Her name was Mary Alice Johnson. She was 24 years old, and like you guys, she was a librarian. She was well educated, bright, had a good sense of humor, loved to read, very beautiful in her way. She was a young lady, and she was on her way to Indianapolis to meet her fiance. Now, one of her favorite things to read were any books that she could find that would talk about ancient mysticism, most specifically anything to do with the Orient. She loved things like that. And she always had her head buried in books about Oriental mysticism. Now, on this trip, of course, it's a long trip from Dayton, Ohio. I mean, trains didn't move very quickly back then. So she had lots of time to get to not only read, but also to introduce herself to her neighbors. And she met a woman with two children who were sitting across from her in the car. And they started talking. And she learned that the woman, her name was Mrs. Franklin, and she was going to meet her husband in Indianapolis with their two sons. Well, Mary didn't think anything of it at the time, but Mary started talking about, well, she's going to go meet her fiance, Mr. Douglas Franklin, and she couldn't wait to meet him. And Mrs. Franklin said, well, that's very unusual. My husband's name is Douglas. And they considered the conversation for a while. Now, they both knew that Douglas Franklin was a traveling salesman. He was a very successful salesman who sold rubber supplies to manufactories all over the Midwest. His normal method of travel, of course, in those days was by rail. So he knew all of the big stops: Columbus, Ohio, Toledo, Ohio, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Nashville, Tennessee. He'd been to them all. Well, they both knew that. But one thing that Mrs. Franklin knew was she had learned recently that her husband, Douglas Franklin, had many other wives. He had a Mrs. Douglas Franklin in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He had a Mrs. Douglas Franklin in Toledo, Ohio. And he had a Mrs. Douglas Franklin in St. Louis, Missouri. So this Mrs. Douglas Franklin was on her way to Indianapolis to see a judge, to see what she could do about getting her marriage annulled. But this was after 6 years, and so Mrs. Douglas Franklin was furious. Well, upon hearing this, Miss Johnson was just completely flabbergasted. I mean, she knew that her fiance sold rubber goods to manufactories, and she knew that he traveled all over the Midwest. She also knew that he was a handsome man, and she wanted to be able to be with him for the rest of her life. But now she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She really thought about it, and then she realized that all this time she'd been lied to, and she became furious. And the longer she thought about it, the madder and madder she got. Now, she'd been reading this book about Oriental mysticism that was going into how emotions can affect the world around you. And while she was getting angry, the weather started to really change. It had been a rather nice evening, but the weather mysteriously kicked up a huge storm. And the madder Mary got, the worse the storm got. Mary was so angry at one point that, well, they don't know exactly what happened, but they know the next morning, this is what was left of the Baltimore and Ohio train that Mary Johnson and 177 other souls were on. There were no survivors. Now, this happened in 1904, but through the years in Indianapolis, where the train was supposed to go, it's been said that the train actually arrived. And those statues of the people that I was telling you about, Marcus and Ernest and Oliver and Augie, those aren't just statues that look like those people. Those are those people. That's what happened when they saw the ghost train of Indianapolis.
Wow, that was great.
Yeah.
I told that to my kids on the way home from a trip to Indianapolis, and just killing time. Told that, and hearing in the back seat because they had just seen those statues, so they knew what I was talking about. It was great.
Awesome. Thank you, Cecil. That was great. Where did you find that story? Is it your own brain? How did you go about making that up?
Well, I knew about the statuary because we'd actually seen them. And I don't know, I was bored. It's a long way from Indianapolis to South Bend, so I just started yapping. And that's how the story came about.
Love it.
Absolutely love it.
Thank you so much. All right. I see that we have had more participants join us. So welcome everybody. Our first guest was Cecil, who told us about a ghost story. Joe, do you mind if I go next?
No, good.
I want to get it out of the way. So this is going to be a story about a tale about King Arthur, and actually this story is about Sir Gawain, but we don't really know that it's about Sir Gawain until about halfway through. And a little bit of background, if you don't know much about King Arthur and the Round Table, Sir Gawain is his nephew sometimes, and he's like one of Arthur's like more noble knights. He's like one of the heroes of the stories. So I will get started. It's like so weird to like actually be performing for an audience again. So I'll go ahead and let me just make sure that everyone is muted here. Okay. One New Year's Day in Camelot, King Arthur and his knights were sitting at the round table making merry when suddenly the doors of the castle burst open and a farm girl rushed inside. Her hair was knotted, her dress was torn, and she was weeping bitterly. "Please, my lord," she said, "you must do something. An evil ogre has moved into Huon Castle, and he's terrorizing our land. He snatches up girls from farms and takes them to his lair, never to be seen again. Please, I beg you, send one of your knights to kill him." Arthur rose and he said, "I will take up this quest to defeat this evil ogre." So he put on his armor and he took up Excalibur, the magical sword forged in fairyland and gifted to him by the Lady of the Lake. Then he mounted his horse and rode through the dark forest until he came to Huon Castle, and he called out to the ogre. "Show yourself, ogre," he said. "I am Arthur, High King of this land, and I command you to come and face me and stop your evil doing or fight me to the death." With an ugly roar, the ogre appeared. He stomped out of the castle and flung open the gates. "Who do you think you are," he said, "to order me around like a servant? I am not afraid of you or that pathetic piece of metal you're clutching. My power comes from witchcraft and devilry and is far more powerful than Excalibur." And then he raised his hand, and lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a clap of thunder. Arthur staggered back as if struck and fell to his knees. "What have you done to me?" he cried. The ogre waved his hand dismissively. "'Tis only an enchantment to shrivel away your strength, but there is a cure. Return here in 1 year's time with the answer to this very simple riddle. What is it that all women long for?" Arthur staggered back to Camelot, bent and broken. He was laid in his bedchamber, surrounded by the knights of the Round Table and the ladies of the court. He told them about the evil ogre's curse and the riddle that he had left them. "Surely," he said, "one of you must know the answer." One of the knights said, "Judging by my wife, it's gold and jewels." "No," said another, "mine only wants expensive dresses." "You're both wrong," said a third. "In my experience, all women want to be flattered." On and on the arguments went, and no one could agree with one another. Finally, Arthur decided to send them all out into the dark forest on a quest to find the answer to the riddle. Sir Pellinore went east. riding through winding paths until he heard an eerie, frenzied tune. He came to a clearing, and there stood a hideous hag in a scarlet cloak, hunched over. Her face was wrinkled and her teeth were blackened. "I am the Lady Ragnell," she said, "and I know what you want." "It's the answer to a riddle, isn't it? Well, I could tell you it." "Then you must," said Sir Pellinore. "Judging by your desperation, it is a very valuable answer. I would require something of equal worth." Sir Pellinore promised her chests of gold and jewels, but the hag only cackled in reply. "What would I want with those things? I have no use for them. What I want is you. You must agree to marry me, and then I will give you the answer." But Sir Pellinore turned as white as freshly fallen snow. "Impossible," he said. The hag replied, "Then begone, you spineless wretch," and she disappeared in a cloud of smoke. At the same time, Sir Kay was riding west through a great storm. He came to a ruined tower, and in its shadow there stood the same hag, hunched beneath the scarlet cloak. "Well met, good sir," she said. "I am the Lady Ragnell, and I know what you're after. It's the answer to a riddle, isn't it? Well, I could tell you it if you agree to marry me first." Sir Kay looked at her in horror. "God forbid, you hideous hag," he said. "Begone with you!" And he swiftly rode past her, leaving her all alone in the storm. Meanwhile, Sir Gawain was riding to the north through a gray mist. He stopped when the hideous hag appeared in the road, and he bowed to her. "Good day, Lady Ragnell," he said. "It is not a good day for me, but a tiresome one. I suppose you're looking for the answer to a riddle too? To save the kingdom?" He nodded and said, "That is correct. And if you are as wise as you are old, perhaps you can tell me, what is it all women long for?" "I know the answer," said the Lady Ragnell, "but I am saving it. But I am keeping it a secret until I find a knight willing to marry me." Sir Gawain looked into her bloodshot eyes, and he said, "I will do whatever it takes to save the kingdom. Come with me to Camelot, and we will arrange our wedding." So Sir Gawain and the Lady Ragnell returned to the castle, and Arthur held a great celebration to commemorate their wedding, although he still languished in his sickbed. Sir Gawain retired early to his chambers with his lady, for he wished to get the whole ordeal over with as soon as possible. The room was in total darkness. While Sir Gawain fumbled for a light, the Lady Ragnell said, "Why don't you come closer, my husband?" He took a tentative step forward. "For pity's sake," said the Lady Ragnell. "A big, strong knight like you, afraid of someone like me? Go on, kiss me." Trembling in the darkness, he planted a kiss on her repulsive, twitching lips. But to his surprise, he discovered that they were soft and sweet. "Here," said the lady, "let me get that for you." She struck the match, and in the light of the flame, Sir Gawain saw that she had been transformed into a beauteous, fair-skinned, golden-haired lady. "Whatever has happened?" he said. "Husband," said the beauteous lady, "by marrying me, you have broken an enchantment placed on me in my youth by my jealous stepmother. But we have no time to waste. Let's go to Arthur's chamber so we can answer the riddle for him." They went to Arthur's chamber, and where all the knights and the ladies of the court were gathered around his sickbed, and they all marveled at the Lady Ragnell's transformation. Arthur smiled at her and said, "Well, my lady, do you have an answer to the riddle? What is it all women long for?" The Lady Ragnell curtsied, flipped her hair over her shoulder, and said, "Why, that's easy, my lord. All women simply want their own way." All at once, everyone around the room began to nod, for never had they heard truer words spoken. Sir Gawain and the other knights helped Arthur onto his horse, and they rode through the dark forest back to the ogre's castle, where they called for him to come out. He stomped out and threw the gates open and said, "Well, you've returned to answer my riddle, but let me warn you, you will only get one chance." Arthur called up to the ogre, "What is it all women long for? To have their own way." Then suddenly lightning raced across the sky, followed by a clap of thunder. The ogre staggered back as if struck by a mortal blow. The castle came crumbling down around him, and he fell into the ruins as if he too were made of dust. Then Arthur's valor returned to him. He mounted his horse, and he led Sir Gawain and the other knights back to Camelot, where they lived for many years in peace. The end.
Whoa. That's awesome.
That was awesome, Karen.
Thank you. It took a while.
Yeah, so you memorized that, right? Impressive.
I actually had to rewrite it because the original story that I was using, there were like a lot more details that aren't like necessary for a storytelling, in terms of like the core, like how it looks in the castle and all that. But
Awesome. Well done.
thank you. I think Joe is up next.
Could do this. All right. Okay. My story is about Wolverines of Michigan. Okay. Wolverines are mean. Mostly they live in Canada, but scientists really don't know where they live. They don't know how many there are left either. This is why they're not officially on the endangered species list. The experts don't know how many are left because Wolverines are generally hard to find. Michigan itself is the Wolverine state. They say there are not actually any Wolverines in Michigan, but I've heard there are. Some believe that Ohioans catcalled Michiganders, they called them Wolverines, during a border dispute in 1835. The result of this border dispute, Ohio got Toledo. So who won? Wolverines are 25 to 50 pounds of pure hate. They have sharp claws and teeth, and they are small but muscular. They have powerful jaws that can crush bones. They tend to be slow, but they are fierce and quick to anger. They are solitary creatures. They don't even like each other very much. Even wolf packs will give a Wolverine some distance. There was an account by an anthropologist who had said that an Alaskan Inuit reported seeing a 1,000-pound polar bear attempt to crush a wolverine against its chest, only to fall dead when the angry devil chewed through to the bear's heart. Wolverines usually travel alone, but 15 years ago, I heard that there was a pack of wolverines that attacked a town in northern Michigan. The small town was up near the Upper Peninsula, the Yup, but it was on this side of the Straits of Mackinac. Residents started finding that their dogs chained outside were going missing. Usually there was some animal remains left behind. After an incident involving some drunken out-of-town vacationers, the townspeople concluded that they did indeed have a predator loose in their woods. Encounters with wild animals have increased as man has built into their natural habitat. This is why you heard that story last week about a bear that was had wandered into some guy's house and he had to fight his way out of his house. I don't know if you guys remember that, but we have moved into their domain, and the animals aren't super thrilled about this. The guy fought off the bear and got away. I think he got away. I don't know if the bear moved in, but I don't know. Wolverines, like I said, are usually solitary hunters, and they tend to be scavengers. When the attacks became too brazen in the small town to explain away, after a few sightings, the town's leadership reported to the state that there was a group of 20 to 40 Wolverines that had evolved and learned to hunt together. The townspeople gathered their hunters together and sent their families away, and they set up a headquarters with all their weapons in a hunting lodge by a lake. After the first 2 patrols they sent out into the woods failed to return, the hunters decided to range out in a larger group to look for the pack. The Wolverines ambushed them, and the group had to beat a strategic retreat back to the lodge. The vengeful Wolverines followed them there. The fearful hunters strengthened their defenses by boarding up their windows, and they called for backup. The first hour they patrolled around the lodge, but when faced with a large gathering horde of the angry animals, they ducked back into the lodge. Outside, they could hear the growls and snarls of the raging beasts. They also heard the continuous impacts of the Wolverines as they attempted to slash and claw their way through the wooden walls. When the conservation officers arrived later, they were able to piece together the last hours of the encampment through cell phone videos and forensic evidence. When the first Wolverines chewed through the lodge front wall, the hunters responded with a hail of bullets. This angered the wounded creatures into an evil funk. The hunters aimed between the little monster's yellow eyes, but Wolverines have thick fur, and that absorbed all but the most direct hits. The blood of the first dead and wounded Wolverines set off a frenzy and howl. The sound was unearthly. When one fell, another savage took its place. They were relentless. The hunters made their last stand by climbing up into a loft. The beasts gnawed at the posts of the loft until it collapsed, spilling the last men into a sea of gnashing teeth. The DNR didn't share that footage, and you'll never see it on YouTube. The victory and meal satiated the pack's anger, and they dispersed into the woods before the backup arrived. You don't hear much about Wolverines in Michigan, and officially there are no Wolverines in Michigan. Occasionally, I'll see a news story that, if you read between the lines, seems to indicate that there might potentially be a large pack of Wolverines that is heading south. The coded references seem to indicate that officials are worried. Of course, officially, there's no word at all. Naturalists at MSU tend to poo-poo such reports, but will say, if pressed, that such a pack would likely travel 20 to 30 miles in a year. I saw a notice in a DNR report, like connected with another website I was looking at, that seemed to indicate that it seemed to me, reading between the lines again, that the pack was east of Dowagiac last summer. And that's maybe hearsay. Is it true? I don't know. Hearsay. We're going to go with hearsay. Yeah, we'll go with that. Ooh. And that story,
Jab, Joe.
that story was told to me in scout camp when I was 14. Except that at that point it was like just outside of Buffalo, New York. It was like in Western New York. So it's a story that goes. It's good for kids, like Cecil's story. It's good for kids. You can scare the willikers out of kids,
and they love it.
They do love it.
Great.
Mel, do you have a story?
I do, if we have time and you would like to hear a story.
We do.
Okay.
Hear a story.
All right. This is a literary short story. Does that count, or should it be a folktale? Okay. Okay. So the story I have brought tonight is a story I read in college and haven't read since college, but it's haunted me ever since then. It creeps up on me when I'm alone. It crept up on me when I left my husband. It crept up on me when I was trying to assemble a bookcase by myself and it fell on my foot. And that story is The Tick by Joyce Carol Oates. And it's a short one. She said, "I can't live with you under these conditions." And her husband said, "But these are the conditions." And he moved out and did not telephone her for several days. And when he did call, she told him quickly, "I'm happy here alone. I've gotten through the worst of it. Don't spoil my happiness again." Since then, the telephone rings at odd hours and she never answers. She will never answer. It's that simple. She does her work in the apartment, spreading her books and papers out on the dining room table, and she is working well. Better than she has in years, but it's all precarious. She knows it's precarious. Not the temptation to kill herself. She understands this is an adolescent fantasy and would never act upon it. But the temptation to succumb to thoughts of despair, self-hatred. Easier, she thinks, to hate yourself than to respect yourself. It involves less imagination. Tonight, contemplating these matters, she runs her fingers through her hair and comes upon a small bump on her head. The very crown of her head. A pimple. Except it isn't a pimple. A mysterious hardness, shell-like. Could it be a tiny pebble embedded in her scalp? But how? She tries gently to dislodge it with her fingernails, but it is stuck fast. What can it be? She's fastidious about grooming, shampooing her hair every morning when she showers. She tries to comb the thing out of her hair first with a plastic comb, and then with a fine-toothed steel comb her husband left behind. But it won't budge. Perhaps it's a tiny wound, a tiny scab, she thinks, and then she thinks, it's alive. It has its jaws in me. And she realizes it must be a tick. Since her husband moved out and it is possible for her to go for days without seeing anyone, she's made a conscientious effort to be better groomed than she ever has been before in her life. Shaves her underarms before the harsh stubble appears, keeps her legs smooth and hairless, always dresses no matter the black rain falling against the window. In the early morning and the faint odors of garbage and wet ashes pervading the apartment building. She puts on lipstick, sometimes even a touch of cologne on her wrist. Pride, she thinks, winking in the mirror. Self-reliance. There you go. She's in the bathroom, trying desperately to inspect the top of her head in the medicine cabinet mirror. Roughly parting her hair, stooping, her eyes rolling up in their sockets. But she can't see. It's impossible. She runs for a hand mirror and holds it at such an angle that she can see into the cabinet mirror where she parts her hair clumsily with the fingers of one hand, and she gives a little scream and nearly drops the mirror. It is a tick, bloated and purplish black, stuck fast in her scalp. She instructs herself to be calm, not to panic, not to give in to the nausea, the gagging. It's only an insect after all. One of those tiny black spider-like things, parasites that suck animal and human blood. It said the woods and the fields are filled with them because of the rain this spring and the heat. Or is it because of the dryness and the heat? They're remarkably quick, darting and leaping and flying, raining from the trees onto unknowing human heads, which is how she must have picked this one up. Walking through the park the other morning, forcing herself to look and to really see the beauty of the natural world, which she lost these past several months. Or has it been these past several years, embarked upon the precarious enterprise of adulthood, wifehood, and loneliness? She recalls that ticks secrete an anesthetic when they bite you, so you can't feel the bite. She recalls they're so hardy they can't be killed by ordinary methods, can't be squashed. The most practical method is to flush them down the toilet. She is digging furiously at her scalp with her nails, and the sink is flecked with blood, her blood, and a number of hairs. No reason to panic, but she can't stop the frantic digging. She's bent low over the sink, panting, cursing, blood beating in her eyeballs and rivulets of sweat running down her back. She feels a sensation of nausea, a taste of something hot and acid at the back of her mouth, but she manages to swallow it down. She thinks of the book she'd been planning to read this evening and the piano pieces by a contemporary composer whose work she admires she'd planned to study and work out through, though she hasn't a piano in the apartment yet. She does intend to buy one. Or rent one soon, now that she'll have more time for it and more energy. And these activities strike her suddenly as remote and preposterous. Her husband once had a medical handbook. She goes to look for it in the bedroom in a pile of books he left behind, but she can't find it. She tries the bookshelves in the living room, then the stack of books in the kitchen beside the refrigerator, mostly paperbacks and shamelessly dusty. And when she's about to give up, she discovers it. The family medical companion. Thank God her husband was so angry and hurt, so eager to get away from her, she'd left it behind. With trembling fingers, she opens it to the section Insects that begins, "Insects are both friends and enemies of man. Some simply annoy by their bites and stings, but a few carry disease-bearing microbes." The paragraph on ticks is disappointingly brief. She reads that she should not try to yank the tick out of her skin since ticks embed themselves so snugly, part of its body will likely remain, and there's a chance of infection. She has her choice of several procedures. She can hold a lighted match or cigarette against the tick's back until it wriggles free. She can coat it in Vaseline, gasoline, kerosene, or turpentine. She can pick the tick off gently with tweezers. She tries the tweezers, tries repeatedly, a dozen times or more, at the bathroom sink until the tweezers slip from her numb fingers. She's crying. Her face is flushed as if with sunstroke. Her eyes in the mirror are those of a deranged woman. To her horror, she feels, or believes she feels, the tick stirring in her scalp, enlivened, enraged, burrowing more deeply into her flesh. She wonders if it has the power to pierce the bone, to embed itself in her very brain. She jams her knuckles into her mouth to muffle her screaming. She's close to hysteria, so she leaves the bathroom and paces about the apartment, from one room to another, in an effort to calm herself. Minutes pass. She has no idea how many. She beats her hands softly together, the fleshy parts of the palms. She tries to breathe deeply and rhythmically. After all, this is such a minor problem, hardly a matter of life and death. If worst comes to worst, she can take a taxi to a hospital, to an emergency room. What if they laugh at her there? What if they're furious with her there? Her with a face like death, trembling and panting as if she'd been physically assaulted, a mere tick embedded in her scalp? More plausibly, she might go next door and ask for help from her neighbor. But when she envisions knocking at the door, handing the astonished young woman the tweezers, and begging her to extricate the thing in her head, she knows she can't do it. She isn't acquainted with the woman even casually. She's a shy, cold girl, very like herself. When they meet in the foyer or in the elevator, each smiles faintly and pointedly looks away, thinking, "Don't talk to me, please. Not right now." Perhaps she should kill herself after all. It would be the easiest solution to all of her problems. By this time, she's walking fast, on the verge of breaking into a run. Can't stop, can't sit down, her heart beating wildly and her breath audible. At the crown of her head, there's a hot, piercing, throbbing pain. Her fingernails are edged with blood. She's rushing from room to room, pacing, turning in tight corners like a trapped animal, hardly seeing where she's careening, her eyes filled with tears of hurt, rage, frustration, and shame. This is what it comes to, she's thinking. This is all it comes to. And she's leaning in a doorway, trying to get her breath, trying to stave off an attack of faintness when she hears the telephone ring and understands it has been ringing for some time. She heads for it like a sleepwalker, propelled by a rough shove. She foresees a reconciliation, lovemaking, both anguished and tender. She foresees starting a child. It's time. That's it.
Wow. Yeah.
Thank you.
Steak.
Wow.
Thanks, guys. That was fun.
You did it very, very beautifully, Mel.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
And then I got like chills in the end.
Can you see it?
That's one that gives me existential terror, like, you know,
Wow.
and especially in this day and age. So.
Right. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like and the more you think about it, you're like, oh man. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
There we are. Thank you, Cecil, Mel, Sarah, me. This is awesome. We'll do more stories because this is great fun.
Mm-hmm.